morning, boys and girls, welcome to the video. As you probably know, I'm a big Sportster fan, and I've just recently sold my Sportster, so I actually have an empty garage, which is very distressing. But it doesn't stop me being a Sportster lover, and I have been following the Sportster story for the last few years, which has got very complicated and very sad, actually. And we get to the point today that I think indicates that the Sportster has a dreadful identity crisis. A sense of identity, I think, oftentimes comes historically. You look back on the who and the what, and that pretty much shapes what you are or who you feel yourself to be in the present. And that's true personally and anthropomorphically, I suppose you would say. But it's also true of products, of inanimate objects and such. We imbue them with personality and identity. And Harley-Davidson, more than most other brands, is very focused on tradition, and the old is very much to be treasured and worked upon, but not changed, so to speak. That's bizarre, really, in the modern world, because the modern world wants to move on, wants to change, new is better and so on. But certainly in the case of Harley-Davidson, the old is very attractive and it's created a multi-billion-dollar brand. So identity is supremely important, particularly to Harley-Davidson. I might say that that's more important for Harley than it is probably for, I don't know about any other brand, but most other brands, and certainly all other motorcycle brands. And that makes Harley itself very attractive to buyers. But this sense of identity, it's key. It's key to the Sportster. The Sportster identity officially began in 1956 when the first Sportster was unveiled, and it's continued for nearly 7 decades. Really, before that, in 1929, Harley introduced a side valve engine which came to be known as the flathead, which formed the bedrock of Harleys for decades to come. Harley-Davidson, after the war, recognised they needed to branch out a little bit. They needed to make a cheaper, lighter, faster bike, because in America especially, Triumph principally, but British brands generally, they were really giving it the spank the yank. It was a difficult time for Harley-Davidson for various reasons, political as well as simply commercial. So they came out in 1952 and introduced a bike called the Model K, which was a 750 flathead, so a side valve again, very old technology, underpowered as well. It didn't compete. It lasted a few years, and by 1956 Harley had announced its replacement. They took the frame and the bodywork, front forks, most of the bottom end of the engine from the Model K, and they reworked particularly the top end to turn it into an overhead valve engine. This was much more what the market was looking for. And so in 1957, Ironhead Sportster in 883cc emerged. It didn't have much success initially, but the seeds were there. It was a fantastic start. And so was born what became a tremendous legacy. For the next 6 or 7 decades, Sportsters, for many, ruled the world. And in forming that identity, that specific and very recognisable branding, they brought to the marketplace many key elements, like the XL moniker. XL is synonymous with Sportster, and Harley fans will always recognise XL means Sportster. That identity was also reinforced with the overhead valves. That was a new development for this particular range, although Harley had introduced finally overhead valves to their bikes even just before the war. There were also 45-degree V-twins. That was and remains a synonymous engine configuration for Harley-Davidson. They're air-cooled, which is a key ingredient. Even nowadays it's a key ingredient. And another, particularly for the Sportster, another iconic part of the identity is the hopelessly placed airbox. How awkward is that? And the exhaust. They both come out on the right hand side, and since they come down from the engine back underneath the footrests, well, you're going to burn your leg on the exhaust. You're going to melt your waterproofs. The airbox sticks out so it's difficult to reach your foorests. We all know this. And part of the joy of not just riding, it is being part of that identity, the Harley brand, the Sportster brand, being involved in that, actively involved in that, participating in that is a wonderful thing. And the Sportster brand, it's going to be changing and developing over those years. And so in 1967, for instance, a decade after it was introduced, the Sportster gets electric start. In 1972, the 883 engine was increased to 1000cc. In 1979, rear disc brakes were introduced along with an uprated frame. But all of this still made it a Sportster. It was actually an Ironhead Sportster. It remained recognisably and completely a sport. Identity was clear. Although things had changed, even the frame, nevertheless, we were still riding Sportsters. There was a bigger shock in 1986 because the motor was changed. The old Ironhead was done away with and a new motor, the Evolution motor, was introduced. It had alloy heads, but it was still a Sportster. It had an 883 or an 1100cc engine, depending on what you wanted, but it was still a Sportster. In 1988, the 1100 became a 1200. In 1991, it gained 5 gears. In 1993, belt drive was standardised, and in 2004, rubber-mounted engines finally were allowed on the Sportster. In 2007, electronic ignition was standardised, and in 2014, ABS was introduced. With all these changes over the years, it was still a Sportster. The identity was clear. There was no question and no doubt. We were still loving Sportsters. But then, a terrible shock. In September 2020, the French website Motor Station reported that there had been no more Sportsters in Europe and in other markets from 2021 onwards. Interestingly, I've never seen an official announcement from Harley about this, but that is what happened. There are now no Sportsters anywhere except the US. And it was widely reported that all Sportster production would end before 2022. So the reality looked straightforward and terrible. The Sportster was dead. Back in 2018, the then boss of Harley-Davidson, Matt Levertich, released the More Roads to Harley plan. And in that plan, the announcement was of a Revolution Max motor and bikes based on that motor to be released in 2020. In reality, everything was delayed, but still, on the 22nd of February 2021, the Pan America was launched. On the 13th of July 2021, the S model was released with the same 1250 motor. On the 12th of April 2022, the Nightstar was released, the 975 version. Unfortunately, the More Roads to Harley program was cancelled and Matt Levertich was replaced with Jochen Zeitz in 2020. In 2021, a video was released called From Evolution to Revolution, the 2021 Sportster S. And that, boys and girls, is the last time I will ever use that hallowed word in connection with this model. In the video, the Model S is touted as a replacement for the venerable old Sportster. Brad Richards, the Vice President of Styling and Design, says, "We wanted to stitch in some of the iconic elements of Sportster design." He identifies the tail section and the 16-inch front wheel. So apparently, the whole identity of the Sportster was in a small section of the tail and front wheel. A wheel and a tail. That is not the Sportster's identity. That is nonsense. The whole video is very heavy on Sportster heritage. There are some wonderful shots of 60s and 70s Sportsters, even the World Speed Record Sportster, wonderful racing bikes and various Sportsters, wonderful. But this S model does not have any of that heritage, unless you count the tail section and the wheel. Oh, I don't even want to talk about that. In 1983, Harley told us they were going for evolution, not revolution. The old Ironhead V-twins were developed into what became the Evolution engine, or the Evo, which we've become so familiar with and so fond of. A few years later, in 1995, a secret P4 program was begun. In 1996, Porsche were commissioned to develop this new engine. It was going to be called the Revolution engine, and it involved apparently just a small team of Milwaukee engineers, according to the Harley history book. In 2001, a V-Rod was launched. The Revolution engine was a Porsche-designed engine. So we have a development from Ironhead to Evolution. From Evolution we go to Revolution. And now we have Revolution being developed into the Revolution Max. To develop the Revolution into the Max, Porsche again were commissioned. And it was sensible. Germany is legendary for its engineering, and Porsche are legendary for developing internal combustion engines. And Porsche have been involved with Harley on and off since 1975, when they began the Nova project with Harley-Davidson. This year, 2022, saw the release of another Harley-Davidson video. It was called The Instrument of Expression, the Nightstar. In the video, much is made of, again, the Sportster heritage. 65 years in the making, they proclaim. Sportster is emblazoned across the screen within a few seconds of the start of the video. They interview London custom builder Charlie Stockwell. He talks of owning and riding Sportsters. He says his girlfriend owned a Sportster, and he talks about making the next generation of the Sportster. The Nightstar is billed as a Sportster replacement. The styling certainly is much more Sportster-like. The silhouette, you can tell, is much more conducive to the Sportster identity. It has twin shocks and a swing arm, which is much more traditional as a Sportster. The airbox fuel tank, which although doesn't contain fuel, it's the same shape, the peanut style. The whole idea of swapping the airbox for the fuel tank is very V-Rod-esque, although it does look Sportster-like. But the Nightstar is different from the other Revolution Max bikes because it's not 1250, it's a 975. And the 1250 Pan America was launched in February 2021. And I kept wondering why the 975 was taking so long to appear. And it didn't appear until April 2022, sort of 14 months later. And there were mock-ups going back, I think, to 2018. And I couldn't understand why it was taking so long to release the 975 version. But when it was released earlier this year, I think I understood at least a bit, because the redesigning of the back end, the rear subframe from monoshock to twin shock, that's a whole different ball game. And to me, it's a great improvement over the monoshock, particularly when you're looking for a Sportster replacement. So the Nightstar apparently is a Sportster replacement. The Nightstar, dare I say it, is the new Sportster. But is it? Well, no. If you go onto the Harley-Davidson website, the Nightstar, it's not a Sportster, it's a Sport, whatever that is. If you go to the parts and accessories catalogue, all the Revolution bikes, they're not listed as Sportsters, they're listed as part of the Revolution Max family. They're not XLs, they're Rs. Harley-Davidson don't recognise the Nightstar as a Sportster. So what do you do if you want a new Sportster? You've got your hard-earned cash and you're desperate for a Sportster. What do you do? Well, first you've got to go to America. If you're outside America, you're stuffed. And the first thing you notice is the price has been hiked by 20% in 3 years. The second thing you notice is that there are only two models now. There's the Iron 883 and the 48, which is a 1200 version. What were there before? 8 or 10 different Sportster models? And on the US website, the Sportsters are listed as cruisers with the soft tails. Since when? But when the Sportster was first announced that it was being cancelled on the US website, Sportsters were listed under the street name, like the old 750 and 500s. And at the same time, they had disappeared completely from UK and Europe, and now they're only available in America. But if you look at the parts and accessories catalogues, they are still Sportsters, despite what Harley are saying. So to call them cruisers, or street as they did before, is insane. I've talked to people on forums, in person, various dealerships. Never once have I heard these bikes referred to as anything other than Sportster. Except by Harley. So we can ask the question, what is a Sportster? It's actually very difficult. It's easier to say what it's not. First, there's the S model. Well, that's not, because the heritage that the S model has got is V-Rod. It's a Porsche-designed engine. Aesthetically, It's really a toned down, less flamboyant version of the V-Rod. The Nightstar too. It doesn't say Sportster, it's not listed as a Sportster, it's a part of the Revolution Max family. So, and what about the actual Sportster? Is that a Sportster? Well, for 65 years, yes it was. But for the last 2 years, suddenly, no it's not. It's something else, depending on where you look on the Harley website. And anyway, it doesn't much matter because 95% of the world can't buy one anyway. So that's about it then, isn't it? It's a sorry story. The Sportster identity has been completely mashed by Harley-Davidson. But some of us love the Sportster. And as I've said in other videos, if I could get the electronics, the traction control and cornering ABS and such, I would have a Sportster in a heartbeat. But I can't get those things on a Sportster. I've sold my Sportster. So what to do? Well, the last best hope for me is the M80. On the 22nd of August 2019, Harley issued a patent on a new overhead valve pushrod engine. It was a Milwaukee 8 developed engine. By that I mean it was developed from the Milwaukee 8 engine, but many postulated that this engine was smaller. There were no specific details or technical details given, but the patent shows a pushrod engine and a very Milwaukee-like design. It had liquid-cooled heads like the Milwaukee bikes and so on. Then a year later, exactly a year later, Harley issued another patent, apparently for the same engine with variable valve timing and cam balancers. The cam balancers in particular were a very important part of the patent. But nevertheless, it was a patent for a new Milwaukee type engine. Very exciting. And for me, absolutely desperately disappointing. A heartbreaker for no doubt at all. Because at the time, I was desperately hoping that this was the engine for the new Sportster. I really did hope that the Sportster would be an M8 and that this new engine was the engine for that Sportster. But since then, since that August 2019 original patent for the new engine, there's been nothing. No patents, no mention, nothing. And there's been no hint from Harley at all about this engine. Perhaps the project's been abandoned. I mean, it's been 3 years. Why wouldn't it? Well, I am not completely devastated. And that's because even though it's been a long time, too long you might think, actually the Harley Porsche V-Rod, that took 6 years to come to fruition, and what was originally the P4 program was steeped in secrecy. Nobody knew anything about it outside the Harley development team. And yet, it did come about. It took 6 years. So maybe this, what has become known in some places at least as the M80, because it's 80-inch or 1340cc, maybe the M80 is still in production, but it's one of those super secret programs that big companies seem to love so much. I don't know, but I hope so. But if the M80 does come to fruition, well, for me, that will be a real next generation Sportster, and I will be front of the queue. Cheerio.